Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Bob Unger Show. Our guest today is a very interesting fellow who I've known quite a while, named Fred Benlein. And Fred is an exercise physiologist by education, but really he's a guy that knows how to solve physical problems, not only in athletes, but also in regular people who have various pains and injuries that they get just from daily life, whether it's lifting something or taking a walk or bending over. And I first met Fred when my son Adam was starting to get serious about playing baseball and trying to become a professional. And Fred was able to keep him on the ball field because whenever Fred would have an injury, he would solve the injury. And the one thing I learned from Fred is that a lot of times if you have a part of your body that is feeling injured and you go to a typical doctor, he'll just go to that particular point on the body where you have the pain. And he'll never look beyond that to see if whether or not it's more of a systemic problem in what you're doing with your body and how you're developing your body. And the pain may not be caused by the area where the pain is located. It may be something else that's out of sync in your body. So Fred, give us a little bit of background in terms of your training and how you learned how to solve these physical problems, and then we'll start getting into more detail.
Well, went to school, study exercise physiology, and then I went for my certification as an exercise physiologist, which is fairly for the American College of Sports Medicine, fairly only a 55% pass ratio on that. But I also went through training by National Strength and Conditioning Association as a strength and conditioning coach, and U.S. track and field. I'm a level 5 IAF coach and a level 3 in U.S. track and field coach in the endurance events. And I've also worked on level 3 in the sprints and hurdles. And the big thing is what I started in my college education was a class in kinese, and kinese is really the scientific study of how the body moves and how the muscles function. And if you can truly understand kinesiology, you really understand how the body works and how to fix the body. And that's really, I've really studied that a great deal since my college education. And I think that's the missing ingredient in a lot of people's background. That kinese is kind of crucial to be able to solve the problem.
Well, Fred, as a frustrated Yankee fan of long standing,
Mm-hmm.
I've been watching all these great players on the Yankees who are super talented. And every time they make a move, they wind up on the disabled list. They run 5 steps and they have a pulled hamstring. They swing a baseball bat and they hurt their lats. They hurt their back. They hurt their shoulders. They get strained calf muscles from just running a little bit. And I say to myself, my God, look at these guys. They're physical specimens. They're incredibly strong and talented. How the heck are they getting injured every 2 seconds? You can't even keep them on the field with the incredible amount of money they're being paid. How does this occur?
Well, there's two separate issues, I'd say. When we're talking about injuries and batting and throwing the ball, the biggest problem is the determinant of how hard or fast you can swing a bat bat or throw a ball is in the decelerators of the human body, which are the upper back muscles and the bicep. And notoriously so, most athletes have very weak upper backs. So this forces the bicep to overwork, and the bicep will take out the shoulder. So that's why you see a lot of your throwing injuries, and some batting as well. As far as things with the lat, same thing is happening. Your lat is now the primary back muscle because people work out their lats. They don't work out their rhomboids and their traps 3 and 4, which are the true decelerators. And instead, you put all the weight onto that lat muscle, and that's going to cause problems when you're swinging something at a high velocity. And also you're bracing, because it's not only the speed of the swing, but it's also the absorption of a ball coming at 95 miles per hour. So there's a lot of factors, and most of these athletes' bodies aren't built to actually train to do that. And as far as hamstrings and lower body exercises, if you watch baseball players run, they just have never learned the fundamentals of running, nor have they strengthened the muscles that allow you to be able to run fast. They've strengthened the incorrect muscles. So, if you build up your hamstrings are an extensor of the hip when you run. They don't actually flex the knee, and there's too much emphasis on flexion of the knee. If you train your muscle to flex at the knee and you're extending the hip, you're going to destroy your hamstring. But a lot of it has to do with pelvis position, the rotation of the pelvis. In most baseball players, their pelvis goes back because their hip flexors aren't working correctly and aren't placing the pelvis in the correct position. And that forces the hamstrings to be lengthened, making them more vulnerable. And it also puts the body in a bad position. It makes it harder for the glutes to fire when they're pushing off the ground, which then puts a greater emphasis on the calves, which then the calves overwork, and then you're going to injure the calves. So everything's related. You can't isolate any one part of the body. Everything fires in a chain. When you're running or when you're throwing, everything starts from the center mass and works out. So the bigger, stronger muscles fire, and then they go to the smaller, medium-sized muscles that then fire, and then fire the small, muscles at the end, which are in the hands and the feet. And the problem is, if you don't fire from, like with the glutes, if the glutes don't fire properly, then you're going to start your explosiveness coming out of your hamstrings going into your calves, and you can't generate enough force to really get the maximum out you're running, but you're also overloading weaker muscles and not using your main muscle, which is in your glutes. And I've never seen a baseball player run where they're actually utilizing their glutes properly. So that's a huge issue. Relatively simple to fix, but a relative big problem if you don't.
Well, how do you explain the fact that years ago, when I was a young kid, you'd watch all these ball players, and they weren't as muscular as the ball players today, and they would not really get injured. I mean, there would be injuries, but they were more or less traumatic injuries. They get hit with the ball, or they break a bone or something in that extent, or they twist a leg. But you didn't see these problems every other day.
Well,
This comfort, all these injuries occur.
Training, here's the thing about training. Proper training will guarantee that an athlete will probably never see an injury. Improper training will guarantee that an athlete will see lots of injuries. So if you train the muscles in such a way, you can increase the probability of injury over someone who doesn't work out at all. And that, I think, would be a major factor. If you look at most athletes, they have a tremendous emphasis on building their chest, building the front muscles, building their biceps, building their arms up. And if you look at the mechanism of an athlete, the more muscle mass, number one, the muscle mass in the front does generate the ability to throw the ball fast, but the muscles in the back generate the force to stop the arm once it's moving at a high velocity. You will never be able to throw faster than you can stop yourself. So the critical issue is how strong is the back muscles, but they put such an emphasis on the front. And when you build those muscles up front and in the bicep, you actually rotate your shoulder forward in such a way that you put yourself in a very high possibility of shoulder injuries, and as well as back injuries, because your body's out of alignment. So if you're out going to the gym and you're doing a lot of bench and you're doing a lot of bicep curls, you're more likely to hurt yourself than if you didn't do any lifting at all. Same thing, if you're in the gym, you're doing a lot of muscle hamstring work, you're going to increase. If you're doing more work on the hamstrings than you are with the hip flexors, then you're increasing your chance of pulling a hamstring. So
I remember, excuse me for interrupting.
No
I remember when Adam had a problem in his toes. Every time he'd run to first base, he'd have terrible pain in his toes.
Mhm.
So at first I went to a podiatrist, I went to an orthopedist, and all they did was look at his toes and x-ray his toes.
Mhm.
Remember, you found when I came to you that he had spasms in his calf muscle.
Absolutely.
And the calf muscle was causing the ankle to not flex because the ankle is a shock absorber, and therefore he wasn't getting any shock absorption. And so the toes were traumatically hitting the ground without the shock absorbers working. And when you got out the contractions and the spasms from his calf, all of a sudden his ankle got loose and it flexed and was able to act as a shock absorber, and he stopped having that pain. And that's kind of an example which kind of emphasizes the difference between you and most people out there. When you go to them with a problem, they're not able to look at it holistically the way that you do. Maybe you can expand on that a little bit.
Well, once again, I think it goes back to that kinesiology and understanding, that everything in the foot's controlled by muscles that are in the calf region. Same thing in the hand, the muscles are up in the upper portion of the forearm. And you have to understand how these muscles work, how to reprogram. The big part is reprogram them, because I've done a lot of work with athletes, and there's literally, I may do a test on their calves, and part of their calf muscles no longer, even the nerves don't even fire the muscles anymore, because they lost the pattern. And other muscles are overfiring, and if you retrain it, not only get rid of the spasm, which is very important, and break that muscle up because of the calcium accumulation in there, but the just retraining the muscle that wasn't doing its job, and all of a sudden it's like your foot moves in a totally different way. And mechanically, that was one of the issues with Adam. His foot used to drop, and if your foot drops, you're not getting proper proper rebound or reaction from the ground. But also in his case, with his toes dropping, then his toes are taking the brunt of his landing, which is 2 to 3 times his body weight when he runs, and 5 to 6 times when he jumps. And those toes weren't designed to take that kind of force. So you can look at the toes all you want, but that's not the issue. The issue is the foot wasn't functioning correctly, and wasn't allowing it to react to the ground the way that it needs to. And it's all about reaction. If you're running running is all about the ability to react to the ground. If you react to the ground correctly, then you run a lot faster, but you also don't do any damage because it's more of a momentum than a break. If you land incorrectly, you're breaking against the ground and you're putting tremendous force against your bones and your muscles. And you're not doing that if you're running correctly. You're just, the force is passing through very gently and very fluent, and it's not really hurting anything. And that's a big problem that you see. If you're not running correctly, you're going to get hurt. It's not running that hurts you, it's the incorrect motion.
I remember you saying that injuries do not occur at the point of that day when you feel the injury.
No.
They actually occur over a long period of time, and then one day you feel the pain.
Usually 1 to 3 years, to be honest. 1 to 3 years build up. Sometimes a little less, depending on how much trauma you're applying to that particular part of your body. But it is a process. It is an accumulation. And when you go into the muscles, you can feel how long it's been by how deep the spasms and the tension in the muscle, the deeper, the longer it's been there.
What would you say is the reason why so many baseball players wind up with at least a strain, if not a torn hamstring?
It's a culmination of two things. Once again, mechanics 100% off on every baseball player that I've ever seen. Their body's in a position where injury is highly likely. And then you have to look at how they train and how they strengthen themselves and where their weaknesses are and where their strengths are. And if you look at the way they move, you'll know that they have strengthened the wrong muscles in the wrong way. And the muscles that would have allowed them not to get injured are not strengthened. So they're like imbalanced, and in that imbalance, I mean, the biggest issue is probably the hip flexors. If you have weak, tight hip flexors, if you think your hips are like a bowl of water, when your hip flexors get tight and they're weak and they get tight, it's like that bowl of water tips forward and all the water pours out. But the other side of the bowl, which is back where your hamstrings are, is now brought up. So the length of the hamstring increases significantly. So before you do anything, the hamstring is already over tight. Its increased length is too long. It's in a position where the force is now too great. So before they even attempt to run, they're already ready to pull a hamstring.
And what about the aspect of stretching to stay loose?
Well, yeah,
stretching going on.
Here's the problem. If you watch somebody stretch, they're going to spend most of the time probably stretching out their hamstrings, saying, "Oh, it feels tight. I stretch my hamstring." But if your pelvis is in a position where it's coming forward and the back is up high, the hamstring feels tight, and you can stretch it, and it will stretch a little bit. But it's the hip flexor that's tight. That's your issue. And if you're not stretching that hip flexor, which is a deep muscle, connects from the front of your thigh all the way back to your back. If that muscle isn't stretched, then it doesn't matter how much you stretch your hamstrings, you're still overstretched to start out with. And if the muscle's too weak, like in the case of the hip flexors, all the stretching in the world doesn't matter, because as soon as you use it, it will fatigue and it will get tight again. So you would have to continuously stretch it. But you're not doing the prep work that's necessary.
I remember, as another example of how the body's parts interrelate, I remember that Adam came off the field and his throwing hand was literally shaking. He had radiating pain, radiculopathy down his right arm. And he thought he had a torn labrum or something like that. And then you asked him to take off his shirt, and you looked at his back and you
Mhm.
saw that the scapular bones in the back were showing. They weren't covered by muscle. You could actually see the bones through the skin.
Mhm.
And it turned out that as soon as you uh, gave him the exercises that he did religiously for quite a few weeks,
Mhm.
he was able to build those muscles in this that cover the scapula, and that pulled his shoulders back. And so he no longer had the impingement that was causing him to have throwing problems. And I remember Bernie Williams, the great center fielder for the Yankees.
Mhm.
If you ever noticed him, he had a posture where his shoulders kind of slumped forward.
Right.
They weren't pulled back. And
Yep.
Williams, even though he was a great player, did not have a strong throwing arm. And I've
No, limits it. Yeah.
that the
Limits it.
guys who throw with really great arm strength usually have very muscular and broad and wide wingspan in their back.
Mhm.
There's a large amount of distance between their shoulders, and their shoulders are thrown back when they walk. They don't walk hunched over. Maybe you can
Yeah.
comment on that.
Absolutely.
You find that to be true as well?
Oh well, absolutely. Because you got to realize, as soon as the biggest issue in any throwing, especially anyone who throws a ball, any object for that matter, is if your upper back is weak, your bicep becomes the decelerator and it becomes very tight. The bicep tendon runs up to the shoulder, it pulls the shoulder forward, and the weak back muscles can't counter the force of the bicep. So you start to get that rounded look. And it's because the rhomboids and trap 3 and 4 are so weak, and the bicep is so overdeveloped that you're bringing it forward. And what in Adam's case, what we did was we strengthened traps 3 and 4. We strengthened the rhomboids. We brought the shoulder blades back, like you're talking about, and we released the bicep, and that was critical. And it's such a big issue because even people who, let's say they're doing lat pull downs or rows, if you actually watch them in the gym, if they don't initiate with those back muscles and they initiate with their arm, it becomes a bicep exercise and not a back exercise, which actually makes the problem worse. So they might be doing the exercise that should solve the problem. Um, but if you do it improperly, it actually makes the problem worse. So there's a lot of potential for that.
Yeah. What would be your suggestions to the Yankees when they have guys like Giancarlo Stanton, who's constantly injuring himself, and even great superstar talents on the team constantly coming down with leg problems and the various
Well,
problems?
the biggest issue is you have to understand the biggest problem we have in sports training is tradition. And people do traditional things like a bench press. And if you really look at the bench press, it could likely hurt your shoulder, but the bench press isn't going to develop your chest. The chest, the pectoralis muscle does not work in that kind of an angle. So with like an example, when I worked with Adam, we did reverse bench presses. We did and with dumbbells, and that's how you get the chest to fire correctly. So it's doing the right on a program with the right exercises. De-emphasis. I never had Adam do bicep work because the biceps don't need development. The biceps will develop when you do back work more than enough. Biceps are overworked muscles. So, it's emphasizing the upper back muscles, um, taking getting away from bicep work, Um, really thinking two things when you're talking about more traditional lifting, instead of doing things like the bench, is doing muscles that will do an exercise that will hit those muscles correctly. And the other thing, which I always kind of been confused by, and I worked with a lot of athletes, including some national ranked collegiate tennis players. To me, it never makes sense when you look at your typical lifting position, all the force is close to the body. And there's no athlete who plays close to the body. All the action that takes place on the field is at the length of the arm. You know, your arm is out when it's catching, when it's throwing, when you're swinging a bat, your arms are extended and the force is out there. So, you know, it's important to strengthen the muscles out in a wide range of motion, with a dynamic flexibility built in. I do a lot of work with pitchers and like I said, tennis players and various different athletes, where in the strength training there is a tremendous amount of dynamic flexibility. We don't sit there and stretch, but we have exercises we do where you're building a tremendous range of motion and a tremendous amount of strength through the range of motion. So that an athlete's strength is as great when his arm is fully extended as it is when it's close to his body, which is a huge mistake we make with athletes when we train them to be very powerful close to their body. That's just not the sport. There's very few sports where that really is an advantage. And then as far as the lower body goes, it's really strengthening so that the hip is in the correct place and the muscles fire in the correct sequence, which is, you know, glutes to hamstrings to calf, and teaching that firing pattern to fire correctly and having the muscles strong enough, having strength in the hip flexors, having flexibility in the hip flexors. You know, once again, dynamic work as well. You know, drill work is, you know, track athletes. I'm, you know, a track coach. Track athletes do a lot of work with dynamic flexibility in their drills. And that is huge. If you want to be able to run, that is a huge part of it. But the other thing is technique and form. And the hardest thing I see with athletes is they want to go do the traditional lifts, but a lot of the traditional lifts, which I, you know, this is why I don't understand, we never run or do anything on 2 feet. At every point in athletics, we generally have 1 foot off the ground and 1 foot working. And that's how you have to train. If you're always training with 2 feet, you're not only building up a weakness in one leg, but you're not training your body to function like it's going to function on the field. And I think that's a huge thing when you're in the weight room, as well as, you know, when you're actually running or whatever. You have to train the way that you want to look on the field. If you train with bad form in the weight room, you will have bad form on the field. It's just, you can't get away.
Did you ever think that the reason why athletes sometimes work the wrong muscles is because they're more interested in looking good to women?
Oh, absolutely.
The biceps.
It's a huge problem. I've spent a lot of time, because I have reached a high level in coaching in U.S. track and field. I got to attend a lot of high performance meetings where coaches, Olympic coaches, sit and talk about. And one of the big problems is with the sprinters. Those guys like being jacked up because they look good, but we've often wondered, at what point does this help them, and is it hurting them? Is that extra upper body weight actually working against them when it comes down to hundredths of a second between winning a medal or not? So, that's a questionable thing. But definitely when you're looking at baseball players, the aesthetic look is destroying them, because, the big thing everyone goes for is the guns. They want those big biceps, and bicep work on a baseball player is a guaranteed shoulder injury. And the same thing, getting that big chest. There's ways to develop a very powerful, very defined chest, but they're more focusing on trying to, to bench out and do stuff to make this stuff look very good. And that aesthetically, number one, like you said, a lot of them around showed it. So I don't think that's exactly, they would look a lot better if their shoulders were back and they had really good posture. So, and that bicep work is actually working against them on that one. So,
Well,
yeah,
Fred,
I agree.
when you're-
Training should not be for aesthetics. Though if you train correctly, the aesthetics will come. I
so
mean,
now I know why I didn't date as many women as I should have, because my
never,
biceps weren't big enough.
I think the percentage of women who like biceps is probably a lot lower than we all think.
So Fred, we are running out of time. So
Okay,
why don't you let the people know a way they can contact you if they want to
sure.
have somebody that can solve their problems, and they don't have to be professional athletes. I've seen you work with
I've worked everything.
and get them functional. So give out your contact info.
Sure. My phone number is 516-728-4754. And my email is F as in Fred, P as in Peter, B as in boy, E as in Eric, N as in Nancy, L as in Larry, E as in Eric, I as in Igloo, N as in Nancy at msn.com.
Okay, well, Fred Benlein, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and we'll be talking more in the future.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for inviting me.
My pleasure.